Well, welcome. We all love a good cup of morning brew or maybe a tea or a second coffee in the afternoon for a little bit of a pick-me-up. I'm talking all about caffeine, which is why I have titled this segment Caffeine 101. You're probably wondering how much is too much? Can I still enjoy all of my favorite energy caffeinated beverages guilt-free? And are there maybe even some health benefits to caffeine consumption? And there is. So join me. Andrea Hallwegner is my name, CEO of Health Stand Nutrition. And our registered dietitian team here answer lots of questions about caffeine consumption, both for adults, pregnant women, kids, families. And I'm going to navigate all of your questions around caffeine here. So if you've got a question for me, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to navigate that both here live as well as those of you watching the replay video at a later time. So the first thing I want to cover is what is caffeine? So caffeine is, of course, a stimulant that stimulates the central nervous system. And I think we're all aware of that sort of feeling of having something caffeinated in the energy that it can bring into the body, which is sometimes positive, maybe sometimes not welcomed because, of course, too much of a good thing is not ideal. But if we run through where we get caffeine, just as a quick overview, I'm pretty sure you know this stuff. Of course, we've got caffeine coming in coffee, espresso, and oftentimes people are actually surprised there's actually a higher level of caffeine in medium roast beans than there is in really dark roasted espresso beans. And then, of course, tea is going to be a big source of caffeine for those of you that are not coffee drinkers. In fact, I'm curious, are you a coffee drinker or a tea drinker or a little bit of both? Let me know in the comments which is your preference. I am definitely a coffee drinker. I start my morning off with a beautiful cappuccino. I say that my cappuccino maker is the queen of the kitchen, and then I switch over in the afternoon to tea. So I guess I would call myself a little bit of both. When we look at the caffeine consumption or levels from comparing coffee to tea, tea is about half that you find in sort of a cup for cup type of coffee. But I have met people that make some pretty thick tar-like tea before, and of course their tea caffeine levels are going to be far greater. So if you want to see a chart of the different caffeine levels in a variety of foods, if you go over to the link that I've provided in the content there, the website link lists a whole table where you can log in and check out the caffeine consumption of a variety of foods. And you'll notice oftentimes we do have parents will ask about like how much caffeine is in things like if they make a homemade hot chocolate at home or buy a chocolate milk. The caffeine level is actually surprisingly quite small. So I put that over in the chart if you want to take a peek. We're talking only 3 to 5 milligrams of caffeine found in a chocolate milk. So for most people, that is far, far less than anything you're remotely going to get when we're talking about teas. But of course, we know some people are a little bit more sensitive than others. We're also seeing that caffeine is, of course, showing up in all sorts of different energy beverages. It shows up in energy shots you can buy at drugstores, convenience stores, and lately even in sport gels as well. So from the performance enhancing benefit of what caffeine can do for athletes. I'll talk a little bit more about that as our session goes on here. But what are the actual surprising benefits of caffeine? And there are a few. We know that, of course, because caffeine stimulates that overall central nervous system, it can boost mental alertness and really just help lessen fatigue. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, it's always finding that balance of not being too caffeinated and too buzzy with energy. But of course, a little is actually not a bad thing, especially if you're in a job that requires more focus, attention, and shift work, those types of things. It can be helpful, but too much of a good thing, not so great. We also know caffeine, because it stimulates the central nervous system and increases alertness, it does help athletes out that are in more, I would say, endurance-like sports. So we're talking things like cycling, long-distance marathon running, triathlon types of sport. And again, this is something you got to test out if you are an athlete and you heard caffeine might be performance enhancing. Of course, it is a banned substance if you are a competitive athlete. A little is okay, too much, again, is considered too much of a banned substance because of the performance enhancing effects. So it's always this fine balance between everything. So what we know about for athletes in endurance sports, taking in a little bit of caffeine before sport or even during sport can help delay fatigue a bit. It can increase endurance and just helps to deal with that perceived exertion. Just makes exercise feel a little less difficult sometimes when you're on a bike or you're in a long running race for a long period of time. So that's one thing to kind of play around with if you're competing in sports or recreationally. Again, you want to test all of this stuff out in training. Never good to experiment with a new caffeine-containing sport gel, let's say, in the middle of your first half marathon. Always, always, always going to want to test everything out in your long training runs. We also know, this is an interesting one, and I've linked over in the website address there on the blog post. You can read the actual original research on this one, but research has shown that moderate coffee consumption, and we're talking about 3 to 4 cups a day, and cups meaning 250 mils or 8 ounces or a 1 cup portion. I think sometimes people think 1 cup is this giant. So we're talking about very small portions here. 3 to 4 cups of those has been linked to a longer lifespan. So this might be good news for some of us that enjoy our morning brews. We also know there's also some interesting research that coffee drinkers actually have a lower risk of Parkinson's disease and type 2 diabetes. So some interesting, if you want to dig into what that's all about, I've left the actual clinical paper there for you to do some for reading for those of you that are kind of geeky nutrition facts people. We also know specifically when we look at green tea, you've probably heard green tea, or particularly lots around matcha tea these days, can be very helpful from a health benefit perspective. And that's because research shows that drinking green tea can be really good for heart disease, lowering the risk of cancers, and we're talking specifically breast cancer, stomach cancers, and prostate cancers here. And it may improve cognitive function in older adults, which we know is a challenge as we get a little older. So, and part of the reason that we see that benefit is the antioxidant load that we find in green tea can be just very good for our overall body. So if you enjoy green tea, if you enjoy experimenting with some matcha tea, I'd encourage you to give it a go, again, within moderate consumption about the levels that we're talking about here. Which brings me to the most asked caffeine question: how much is too much? So I've got that all in the website link there where you can read a little bit more about how much is too much. But I am going to say, when we're talking about adults here, we're going to say that 400 milligrams per day or less is what we would consider to be a good target for coffee or for caffeine in general. And you might say, Andrea, what does 400 milligrams of caffeine look like? So I've got it all on the chart for you to compare. But if we're talking about coffee here, we're talking about 2 to 3 cups of coffee per day. And again, some of us brew it a little bit stronger. Some of us do espresso shots. And some of us, again, get confused at what 1 cup actually looks like. But if you want to look at all the data, I've got it in the report there for you to compare how much is too much. So again, if we're thinking about the average coffee sizes that people buy in a coffee store, if you're thinking about a grande sized, Starbucks coffee cup, you're definitely getting at least a couple of cups in most coffee cups, unless we're talking about those tiny little styrofoam cups that we get at, I don't know, maybe your local church or coffee room at work. Those are what we're considering 8 ounces or 250 mils. So the average coffee shop, we're probably looking at starting at least 2 to 3 cups already in whatever you're picking up there. So we're talking about keeping it to maybe 1 of those larger mugs of coffee per day or several of those small ones. And that would be considered a really reasonable caffeine level for most people. So what we know, of course, if you're getting too much coffee, I think, we're all aware of the practical side of it can create that irritability, anxiety, can certainly affect sleep. So if you're sensitive to caffeine, we always say wind it down around lunchtime and keep your afternoons caffeine free if you know that it takes a long time to get out of your system and can keep you up. We also know that caffeine can cause stomach upset. It just changes what's going on in the digestive system. So if you've got a sensitivity around your gut, you might find that caffeine consistently is going to be something that you need to look at. So days that maybe if you've got a sensitive stomach, what we find is that some days having coffee, sometimes having two different strengths of caffeine is going to do a number on your gut. So it's best to keep caffeine fairly consistent day in, day out if you've got a bit of a sensitive stomach. So I do want to tie in some information around pregnancy here because the levels of caffeine is a little bit different here. And that's because caffeine does pass through the placenta to a baby, and babies also take longer to process caffeine. So we've got to be a little bit more concerned here around pregnancy, but this doesn't mean necessarily you need to give up coffee altogether if you're pregnant. I remember when I was pregnant, I remember coffee not being even appealing, which was very foreign and bizarre to me because it was one of my favorite things to wake up and enjoy my cappuccino. But during pregnancy, all of your smells and tastes, everything becomes so different. I remember not even wanting to go there. But had I felt like drinking coffee, I can say that research has suggested that a little bit of caffeine during pregnancy is totally fine. But what we're after is about half the amount of what we would recommend if you are not pregnant. So that's 200 to 300 milligrams of caffeine per day for pregnant women. And we know that's about, again, the amount in like 1 to 2 cups, those little tiny styrofoam cups that many of you have seen that your grandparents probably used a long time ago. That's the level we're talking about. Or maybe like 1 mug of coffee per day if you're pregnant would be the amount that we're talking about there. So when we get into kids, I've also given you the data there because what we're finding is so many kids are choosing pop primarily. We're seeing lots of, I would say, younger athletes moving over to energy-based beverages, and particularly in certain sports like hockey. So I want you as a parent, if your kids and your teens are looking at consuming those things, just pop on over to the information I've left in the table on my website link there and just take a quick peek as to what that actually looks like. Again, kids under 12, we really want to have absolutely no coffee, no tea, no energy beverages coming in, and very little pop consumption because, of course, we know it is not great for health, not good for your dental health. But a little bit, of course, is going to happen because that's what being a kid is all about. But if you're curious as a parent what those recommendations look like, particularly if you've got teenagers in the house, really looking at just knowing what those guidelines are and speaking to your kids about that, at least trying, I think that's a good way to begin, as I see all the kids, doing their iced beverages this summer and their energy beverages in conjunction with sport. We just want to make sure that they've got a little facts behind them. So choosing some healthy caffeinated beverages, what does that look like? Well, of course, I would say the more simple and plain, the better. So, obviously making a standard Americano, a plain black coffee. And if you're going to have something in it, i.e. cream, milk, make a latte cappuccino, then we want something that actually uses the real stuff that your grandparents would recognize as actual food. So my suggestion is you stick to plain milks, plain creams. Of course, if you can't do dairy, things like unsweetened almond milks, unsweetened soy milks are going to be your next best choice. Of course, a lactate-based milk as well, lactose-free milk for those of you that have difficulty digesting milk could be options. And one of the benefits of putting a little bit of a calcium-containing milk or milk beverage or milk alternative beverage into your coffee is it negates a little bit of that loss of calcium that we see in the urine from drinking coffee. So you've probably heard too much coffee isn't good for your bones, but what we know is, again, it's mostly excessive coffee drinkers and also failure to get enough good calcium into your diet. That's really the problem. If you're keeping within the caffeine recommendations we're talking about here, and as well, if you don't mind putting a little bit of a milk or a milk alternative beverage in there, it tops up your calcium and it really negates that loss. Even a few tablespoons in your coffee actually will help negate that loss of calcium we see in the urine. So that's just a little FYI tip there. Now, what we want to be thinking about when we're talking about unhealthy caffeine beverages, I'm going to speak directly to all of the smoothie-like, sugar-sweetened iced cappuccino beverages that I see a lot of companies consuming, and that get super popular at the summer time of year. So again, I'm not going to recommend that you go those. I kind of think they're more like a Slurpee with a shot of coffee or espresso added into there. So if you'd like to learn how to make one from home, in the blog post, I've put some recommendations on how you can do your own cold brew at home, how you can do your own fresh iced cappuccino, and some healthier ways that you can sweeten them. So go check that out on the blog post. And that is going to be your best bet going forward for making healthier iced cappuccino beverages from home. Speaking of cold brew, people like, what are cold brew? You're hearing lots about cold brew these days. I would say it's a fairly big trend. You're probably going to see more cold brews on a lot of restaurant and coffee shop menus. And I think it's because it's got a beautiful flavor for those of us that enjoy coffee and like to have more of an iced style coffee throughout the summer. And so how you make cold brew is actually quite simple if you ever wanted to try it. I've given the instructions in the website blog link there, but generally you grind your beans coarsely, and when I've made it in a French press coffee maker, and I just combine those beans with cold water. I let them sit in a Bodum style or French press coffee pot overnight, let them infuse for about 12 hours, and it slowly and gently sort of gets that nice coffee flavor coming in. Whereas if you left coffee hot and left it for 12 hours, of course, we get some of the bitterness and things showing up, which isn't quite as pleasant. So the cold brew really allows that beautiful, gentle flavor to come in. And then you're able to really kind of mix that with some cold milk and some ice. Pop it into the blender, and if you want to sweeten it a little bit, rather than just dumping a bunch of sugar in there, I'd encourage you to sweeten with natural foods. So try some banana in there, try some dates in there. As long as you got a good blender, those dates will blend right up and add a beautiful flavor into your iced coffee. So the ratio for making a cold brew is starting off with about a quarter cup of beans and adding about a cup of water, and then just letting that slow sort of process of leaching happen overnight. So if you tried cold brew, I'd be curious to find out your experience, if you like the flavor and what you think. And if you haven't, give it a go this weekend and enjoy a iced cappuccino on your patio and see what you think. Now, for those of you that might be more interested in matcha tea, maybe you're not a coffee drinker and you heard matcha tea is healthy, you like the flavor of it, I'd encourage you to try it in a cold beverage this summer. So matcha tea powder, of course, you can dump right into a smoothie. We know it flavors really beautifully with your tropical fruits, things like your frozen mangoes, frozen pineapple. Dump in some ice, some unsweetened juice, a little bit of matcha tea powder there. And of course, for those of you that like green smoothies with a little bit more vegetable kick, I'd encourage you to toss in a handful of kale, spinach, or Swiss chard to really add some fantastic extra nutrition into your summer beverage. And easy to do. So that is my scoop on some healthy ways to caffeinate that don't allow too much, but just enough to give you a little bit of kick of energy. And I'm curious, in your comments here, let me know what you thought about today's information, if there's anything new, or if you've got a question for me on caffeine that I didn't cover, certainly let me know in the comments. And if you'd like more information about healthy eating, every Wednesday I'm back on video here teaching a topic about healthy eating that is relevant to the types of clients that we see in our individual nutrition counseling practice here and in the online course group that I facilitate. Be happy to answer some questions going forward. So I hope you'll join me again. And if you'd like to make sure you don't miss these segments, the best way to do that is hop on over to our website, which is healthstandnutrition.com. And you can sign up for our weekly newsletter. It's free and it's loaded with all sorts of great nutrition tips. We've got, definitely well over 5,000 people a week that get our newsletter because we spend good time on developing rich content. We always put copies of our videos in there if you're interested in catching them. And I know that our recipes are always very popular. So you're going to get all of that in our free newsletter, and you just have to hop on over to healthstandnutrition.com and you can sign up for your subscription. So thanks for joining me today, everybody. And for those of you watching the replay, let me know. I'm still curious. Are you a coffee drinker or a tea drinker? I'd love to take a vote. Okay, signing off for now, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.